Every power that had moved in this conflict had moved with the instrument the world could see. Turkey had repositioned frigates and run a logistics convoy through open water. Russia had deployed S-400 batteries to a base that satellite imagery confirmed within hours. China had moved 8 surface combatants to the entrance of the world's most critical oil choke point and let insurance markets do the rest. Iran had issued a deadline with a clock that every trading desk and foreign ministry on Earth was watching in real time. Each move had been visible, trackable, analyzable, the kind of power projection that military planners and intelligence services know how to assess because they can observe it, measure it, and model its implications. What nobody had been looking for, because nobody had been looking in the right place, was the instrument Turkey had been building for years that operated in none of those dimensions. The instrument that left no satellite signature, produced no insurance premium spike, triggered no naval alarm system, and arrived at its destination without a single uniformed soldier crossing a single internationally recognized border. The instrument that, when it was finally revealed on May 8, 2026, changed the regional balance not by adding force to the battlefield, but by removing the foundation beneath the parties that had been fighting on it. If this is the kind of reporting you want, no spin, no shortcuts, the full picture, subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it keeps this work going. Because what Turkey revealed on May 8th is not a weapon in any conventional sense of the word, and understanding why it is more consequential than any of the weapons that had already been deployed requires starting not with what it is, but with how Ankara built it, over how many years, and for precisely what purpose. Turkey's regional strategy under Erdogan had always had 2 layers. The visible layer was the one the world had been watching for a decade: the military interventions in Syria and Libya, the drone warfare program that had made Bayraktar a household name in conflict zones from Nagorno-Karabakh to Ukraine, the naval expansion in the eastern Mediterranean, the assertive foreign policy rhetoric that positioned Ankara as the unapologetic defender of Muslim interests and Palestinian rights in a way no other NATO member had been willing to sustain. That layer was real and consequential, but it was also the layer that adversaries could plan around. Because visible power is manageable power, you can build defenses against a Bayraktar drone. You can track a Turkish frigate. You can model the escalation logic of a country whose military capabilities and political incentives you can observe and measure. The invisible layer was different in kind. It had been constructed not through military procurement or naval expansion, but through a decade of patient, systematic cultivation of human networks: financial, political, religious, and intelligence networks embedded inside every significant country in the Middle East, inside every significant institution of regional governance, and inside the domestic political structures of several states, whose governments had no idea how deep those networks ran or how activated they could become under the right conditions. Turkey had been building in plain sight but below the threshold of strategic attention, what intelligence professionals call an influence architecture, a distributed system of relationships, dependencies, financial flows, and political obligations that could be activated simultaneously to produce effects that no military's deployment could achieve and no military response could reverse. What Turkey activated on May 8th was not a single element of that architecture. It was the entire system simultaneously in a coordinated demonstration that had been prepared for months and timed for exactly this moment, the moment when the regional alliance structure had fractured enough that the parties holding it together no longer had the cohesion to resist what was coming, and the moment when the Istanbul conference Turkey had proposed was close enough to provide a framework into which the consequences of the activation could be channeled toward a specific political outcome. The first element of Turkey's secret weapon was financial. Over the preceding decade, Turkish sovereign wealth vehicles, state-affiliated investment funds, and a network of private Turkish business interests had established significant financial Positions inside the banking and real estate sectors of 3 Gulf states, positions large enough that their simultaneous liquidation or restructuring would produce measurable stress in those states' financial systems. The positions had not been built as weapons. They had been built as investments, as relationship capital, as the natural accumulation of economic engagement between a large regional economy and the wealthy Gulf states it had been cultivating. But financial positions of sufficient scale are always also leverage, and on May 8th, Turkey began moving those positions in ways that sent an unmistakable signal to the finance ministries of the affected states about what a full liquidation event would look like. No official statement accompanied the financial moves, no demand was issued. The moves themselves were the communication, and the communication was received with the clarity that only a credible financial threat produces in a finance ministry. The affected states were not named publicly. The signal was not intended for public consumption. It was intended for the specific officials in specific ministries who would understand what they were seeing and what it meant for their government's posture toward the Istanbul Conference Turkey had convened for the following week. The second element was political. Turkey's religious and cultural networks across the Arab world, the mosque networks, the educational institutions, the media platforms, the civil society organizations that Ankara had funded and cultivated, through the Diyanet, through Turkish state broadcaster TRT Arabic, through a decade of scholarships and cultural exchange programs, activated simultaneously on May 8th with a coordinated messaging campaign that framed the Istanbul Conference as the defining moment of regional solidarity, the first genuine Arab and Muslim response to Israeli military conduct that went beyond statements, and the opportunity for the region to demonstrate that it could organize its own security architecture without American management or Israeli acquiescence. The messaging was sophisticated in ways that generic propaganda is not, because it was tailored to the specific political vulnerabilities of each country's domestic audience. In Jordan, where the Palestinian demographic majority had been applying political pressure on the government since March 28th, the messaging emphasized Palestinian rights and the conference as the framework through which Jordan could honor its obligations to its own population. In Egypt, where the government's legitimacy has always rested partly on its claim to Arab leadership, the messaging framed non-attendance at Istanbul as an abdication of the role Egypt's history required. In Saudi Arabia, where the religious establishment's relationship with the government is the foundational pillar of al-Saud legitimacy, the messaging operated through religious channels in ways that the Crown Prince's secular modernization project was structurally poorly positioned to counter. The third element was the one that produced the most immediate operational consequences and the one that intelligence services in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh had least anticipated. Turkey had spent years developing a specific technical, the capability that sat at the intersection of its drone warfare program and its intelligence architecture, the ability to provide real-time battlefield intelligence, targeting data, and electronic warfare support to non-state actors through a system that left no attributable signature in the communications or targeting infrastructure of the recipient. The system had been developed, tested, and refined through Turkey's operations in Syria and Libya. It had been quietly extended to Hezbollah's operational command structure in the weeks before March 28th. In a way that the intelligence assessments that had underestimated Hezbollah's fighting strength at 5,000 fighters had entirely failed to detect. What Israel had been fighting for 5 weeks, the remarkable operational coherence of a non-state actor absorbing sustained Israeli air and ground assault and continuing to function as a coordinated military force, the precision of Hezbollah's anti-tank ambushes, the discipline with which tunnel networks had been used to move fighters out of positions before Israeli fire arrived, the accuracy of Hezbollah's targeting of Israeli commanders and radios. Operators had not been produced by Hezbollah's own capabilities alone. It had been produced in significant part by a Turkish intelligence and targeting support system operating in the background of every major Hezbollah engagement since the operation began, invisible to Israeli intelligence because it operated through channels and frequencies and technical architectures that Israeli signals intelligence had not been programmed to look for. The revelation of this system did not come through Israeli intelligence discovery. It came through a Turkish decision to reveal it, a deliberate act of strategic communication, timed to coincide with the opening of the Istanbul Conference preparations and designed to make clear to every party in the conflict exactly what Turkey had been contributing to Hezbollah's resistance and what it was capable of continuing to contribute if the diplomatic framework Turkey was proposing was not taken seriously. The disclosure was made through a single communication from the Turkish Foreign Ministry to the Israeli government through back channels, accompanied by a technical summary of the system's capabilities and a dossier of specific engagements in which Turkish intelligence support had contributed to Hezbollah operational outcomes. The dossier was not released publicly. It did not need to be. The Israeli military command, its reaction to receiving it, a reaction that produced an emergency session of the full General Staff within 2 hours of the document arriving, was visible enough in its intensity to communicate to every intelligence service, tracking Israeli decision-making that something significant had changed in Israel's understanding of what it had been fighting. For Israeli commanders who had been processing the intelligence failures of the preceding 5 weeks, the dossier was not simply new information. It was the explanation for a pattern that had been anomalous throughout the campaign, the operational coherence that had survived 5 weeks of sustained assault, the targeting precision that had been killing Israeli officers and radio operators at a rate that degraded command function more efficiently than any random casualty pattern would produce, the ability of Hezbollah units to withdraw through tunnel systems before Israeli fire arrived with a timing that seemed to exceed what organic Hezbollah intelligence capacity could explain. All of it became comprehensible in a new way when Turkish signals intelligence support was added to the picture. The intelligence failure of March 28 had not been only about Hezbollah's strength and preparation. It had been about a Turkish contribution to that preparation that Israeli intelligence had not detected and had not included in any of its operational planning assumptions. The military implications of this revelation were immediate and severe. 5 weeks of operations had been conducted against an adversary whose actual capability had been materially enhanced by a NATO member state's intelligence and technical support, a support that remained active, that could be continued or escalated, and that Israel had no identified means of neutralizing without direct action against. Turkish systems that would constitute an attack on a NATO member. The legal and strategic architecture of the situation was precisely what Turkey had designed it to be, a contribution significant enough to matter decisively on the battlefield, delivered through means that placed Israel in a position where addressing it through military means was impossible, and addressing it through diplomatic means required engaging with Turkey on terms Ankara had been seeking since the crisis began. In Washington, the Turkish disclosure arrived as a dual crisis. The intelligence failure it revealed was American as well as Israeli. American signals intelligence assets in the region had been monitoring Turkish military communications throughout the crisis without detecting the specific architecture Turkey had used to provide Hezbollah with battlefield support. The gap in American intelligence coverage was not a minor operational oversight. It was a structural failure that reflected the degree to which Turkey had developed technical capabilities specifically designed to operate below the detection threshold of American and Israeli collection systems, capabilities that had been applied in a running combat operation against Israeli forces for 5 weeks without detection. Every assessment of Turkey's military and intelligence capabilities that American agencies had produced in the preceding the years required immediate fundamental revision. The political crisis the disclosure produced was in some ways more acute than the intelligence failure. The United States was now in possession of credible evidence that a NATO member state had provided direct operational intelligence support to a non-state actor designated as a terrorist organization by the United States in a conflict in which that non-state actor had killed hundreds of Israeli soldiers who were allied with and equipped by the United States. The legal and alliance implications of that reality were impossible to navigate cleanly. Formally invoking NATO mechanisms against Turkey would fracture the alliance at a moment when its cohesion was already under pressure from the broader consequences of the conflict. Ignoring the disclosure would validate Turkey's calculation that it could provide this kind of support to adversaries of NATO partners without consequence. The precedent whose implications extended far beyond the current conflict, the middle path, private condemnation combined with public silence, preserved alliance form while destroying alliance substance, and everyone who mattered knew it. Erdogan's calculation, which had been running since before the Turkey's first visible intervention in April, was now fully visible in its architecture. Each of Turkey's moves had been designed not as an isolated action, but as the component of a cumulative pressure strategy whose endpoint was the Istanbul Conference, a diplomatic forum convened by Turkey, organized around Turkish priorities, attended by regional powers whose participation Turkey had secured through a combination of financial positioning, political network activation, and the demonstration of military and intelligence capabilities that made Ankara's relevance impossible to dismiss. The conference was not designed to resolve the conflict on terms any single party dictated. It was designed to establish Turkey as the indispensable convener of whatever order emerged from the conflict's resolution, the power without whose participation no durable regional arrangement could be constructed. The Istanbul Conference opened on May 9th with representatives from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Iran, Lebanon, Russia, and China in attendance. The United States attended as an observer, a status it had contested and ultimately accepted because the alternative was absence from the most significant regional diplomatic gathering of the decade. Israel was not represented directly but had communicated its positions through the Qatari mediation channel that ran in parallel with the conference proceedings. The Turkish foreign minister opened the session with a 40-minute address that outlined what Ankara called the Istanbul Framework, a proposed regional security architecture built around 5 principles: immediate ceasefire in Lebanon verified by a multilateral monitoring force with Turkish participation, a regional maritime security arrangement for the Gulf that included Chinese and Russian participation, alongside American presence, the Palestinian political process framework that the conference would endorse collectively, a regional economic reconstruction fund for Lebanon capitalized by Gulf states with Turkish and Chinese institutionals participation, and a permanent regional security dialogue mechanism convened annually in Istanbul. Each element of the framework was designed to institutionalize Turkish centrality. The multilateral monitoring force for Lebanon would include Turkish troops, giving Ankara a physical presence on Israel's northern border for the first time. The maritime security arrangement would formalize Chinese and Russian roles in Gulf security alongside the Americans. The presence, ending the American monopoly on that architecture. The Palestinian process framework would give Turkey the political credit with Arab and Muslim publics for having forced a political outcome no American-managed process had produced. The Reconstruction Fund would build Turkish institutional relationships with Gulf capital and Lebanese reconstruction needs simultaneously, and the annual dialogue mechanism would make Istanbul the permanent address of regional security deliberation, with Ankara as its host and convener indefinitely. The framework was ambitious to the point of being partially unrealistic in its immediate application. Not all of its elements would survive contact with the detailed negotiations that would be required to implement them. The American observer delegation spent the first day of the conference working every bilateral relationship in the room to limit the scope of what the conference would formally endorse. The Gulf states, who had come to Istanbul for their own reasons and with their own priorities, were not unified in their enthusiasm for every element of what Turkey was proposing. Iran wanted security guarantees that went beyond what the framework's current language provided. Russia wanted a more explicit role in the monitoring mechanism than the draft document specified. But the framework did not need to be implemented in full to have achieved its primary purpose. Its primary purpose was not the document. Its primary purpose was the gathering, the fact of these parties in this room, convened by Turkey, discussing the future of regional security in a format that America had not organized and could not control. That fact, independent of what the document ultimately said, was the demonstration of a new regional reality that Turkey had been building toward for a decade and had now achieved. The secret weapon had not been any single capability or any single move. It had been the patient construction of the conditions under which this room, this gathering, this convening could take place in the willingness to deploy every instrument available, visible and invisible, military and financial and political and intelligence-based, to bring those conditions into existence at the moment when the conflict had created the opening for them. For Israel, the Istanbul Conference and the revelation of Turkey's intelligence support to Hezbollah combined to produce a strategic assessment unlike any the state had been required to make in its modern history. The conflict had begun as a military operation designed to address a specific security threat on its northern border. It had produced a regional diplomatic realignment that placed Israel in a more isolated position than it had occupied since the years before Camp David, while simultaneously revealing that the operational intelligence supporting the adversary it had been fighting was provided by a country Israel could not militarily address without consequences that extended to the foundational architecture of Western security. The operation's original objectives had not been achieved. The regional environment in which future operations would be conducted had been transformed in ways that made those objectives harder, not easier, to achieve, and the domestic political cost of what the operation had produced was now accumulating with a speed that the government's communication strategy was no longer able to manage. The ceasefire framework document that Qatar had been carrying between Jerusalem and the conference was revised for the 14th time on the evening of May 9th, incorporating elements of the Istanbul framework that Israel's negotiating. The position had been adjusted to accommodate. The adjustments were not capitulations. They were the product of a rational calculation about what was achievable in the environment that now existed. Compared to what the original operation had been designed to achieve in the environment that had existed on March 27th, the gap between those two things is the measure of what 5 weeks of conflict, great power intervention, alliance fracturing, and the revelation of Turkey's secret weapon had produced. The soldiers who had been in the buildings in southern Lebanon since March 28th were still waiting for a clarity that the people making decisions above them had spent 5 weeks failing to provide. The families at home were still waiting for a resolution that the world's most capable diplomats and the world's most powerful governments had found, repeatedly, to be just beyond what the moment allowed. What the Istanbul Conference and Turkey's revealed architecture had produced was not resolution. It was the first moment since the operation began when the shape of a resolution was visible, not on the terms anyone had intended when this started, not in the time frame anyone had planned for, not with the costs anyone had calculated, but visible nonetheless in the outline of a framework constructed by a power that had spent a decade preparing for exactly this moment and had deployed everything it had built toward producing exactly this outcome. What do you think? Has Turkey permanently established itself as the indispensable power in the new Middle East order? Or has Ankara overextended in ways that will produce a serious strategic correction? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every comment pushes this video to more people who need to see the full picture. And if this is the kind of reporting you want, complete, independent, no shortcuts, no spin, subscribe. This channel covers what others skip. It is fully independent, and the support link is below. Every contribution goes directly into keeping this work going.